The goal of tonight's show is to not talk wide receivers the entire time. However, it's going to be a challenge because there's a lot of stuff going on in the NFL right now, and we'll try to get to as many things as we can, non-receiver related, but we're talking about wide receivers. It is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. Hi, hello, and welcome. 7 p.m. on Thursday means it's time for the Better Sports Network. I am Eric Balkman, at Eric Balkman on the X, of course. High Stakes Fantasy Football over RotoViz, High Stakes Lowdown, and the Fantasy Football Players Championship. You just saw the graphic that popped up. The Fantasy Pros Championship has drafts filling every day at myffpc.com. Enter the weekday giveaway right now as well. If you want to, you will be entered into a drawing. If you draft before midnight tonight, you will be entered in a drawing for 3 Fantasy Pros Championship teams that we will be giving away prior to the weekend. We'll be giving away tomorrow. So if you want to be eligible for that, myffpc.com is where to go, or scan the QR code on your screen right now. A $1 million grand prize, just a $350 entry fee, a $6 million prize pool. Check it out over at myffpc.com. Don't forget about the best ball tournaments we have there, the main event, and of course, the Empire Leagues and the Empire Dynasty Leagues that we have going on over at myffpc.com, myffpc.com. The main event on tonight's show is tonight's co-host. You know him from Living the Stream. You know him from lateround.com. He is the incomparable JJ Zachariason. JJ, welcome in tonight. So glad to have you back on the show.
Yeah, man, it's great to be here. Great to chop it up. I'm looking forward to it.
It's going to be a lot of fun. On tonight's show, we're going to go around the NFL. We're going to talk a little bit about Nico Collins. We'll get into Jackson Smith-Njigba. Mike Gesicki we'll also get into in this first segment. After that, we're going to find out where JJ stands on certain players, like T. Higgins, like Jameson Williams, like Malachi Corley. And then in the second hour, we'll find out, we're going to put JJ on the clock. Would he rather draft Devonte Adams or Tyrone Williams? Would he rather draft Anthony Richardson or CJ Stroud, Keon Coleman or Xavier Worthy? All those topics we'll get to. And then we'll take a quick spin through the late round draft guide, which you can get right now at lateround.com. We're going to get into some philosophical stuff, drafting philosophy, which I know you are well versed in, JJ. And I was reading through it. It is immaculate. It is really, really good stuff. And first selfish question I'm going to ask, how do you come up with a fresh way to attack this draft guide every single year when you're building it for late round?
Yeah, I think that's honestly the toughest part, because I really try my best to make sure that it's really game theory driven. It's not so much player take driven, right? Because you can get player takes everywhere, and there's a lot of guides like that. And nothing against those guides. Like, I even have player takes and players to target, players to avoid, late round dart throws in the late round draft guide. But to me, it's really like I try to think to myself, how can I, or what if I were a consumer? What are the game theory related things that I would want to read? And, every year I kind of sit back and I take my time to really come up with the ideas and the ideation around it before I really start digging in and writing and analyzing and all that kind of stuff. So there is a process of like coming up with the ideas for the guide that honestly takes longer than some would probably realize whenever they, just pick it up and start reading it.
When does that process begin for you? I mean, I would imagine that there's times during the season where you're seeing something and you're seeing something develop, you research a little bit and you make a little note, on whatever, like, oh, you know what? I should attack something like this in the draft guide next year because it's bubbling up already. When does that process begin? Or quite frankly, JJ, does it ever stop for you? Yeah. Is it always evolving?
That's the thing. It's always going on. There's definitely pockets of the year, because I do like the prospect guide too. Mm-hmm. And with the prospect guide, that's definitely like my, February to March kind of thing. And then there's a little bit of a lull before the NFL draft actually kicks off. And then once the NFL draft happens, and I got to update it and do all that, and then May hits. But throughout the year, when things pop into my brain, I try to write it down. Like, I have an Evernote that I'm always just adding to and, trying to keep track of. And when other people come to me, some of this stuff is also like other people coming to me and asking questions and me realizing, wow, that's actually a pretty good question that I've never really dug into in that much detail. And then I kind of add that, to the stuff that I've already kind of established. So like, to me, the draft guide is sort of yes, it's a yearly product, but it's something that builds off of each one builds off of the other. Right. So, if you look at the first iteration that I did 2 years ago, this is the third iteration. But the first iteration that I did to this one, there's definitely overlap, because the ideas in fantasy football about variance and about, the running back dead zone and these things, like, they're not going to change that dramatically. But at the same time, I'm adding to it so that people can kind of have a different angle and a different way of looking at this stuff.
I think that, like journalism and analysis, like everybody always says, it's never done. It's just due, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the case with your draft guide too. We are constantly building, you're constantly adding, you're constantly taking stuff away, modifying everything. Yep. And it just happens to be released once a year, right?
Exactly.
But like it's a living, breathing thing, right. 365 days a year. 100%. Well, we'll get into that for sure in coming up in the second hour. And quite frankly, we're going to make reference to it throughout the program tonight. I want to kick things off out in Las Vegas with Davante Adams. Now, the Club Shay Shay podcast, hosted by Shannon Sharp, Davante Adams was on. He says he's locked in with the Raiders. There's rumors that he was on the trading block. I was listening to Theo Greminger talk about this the other day when he thought the Breece Hall interview, I think he was on Kay Adams' show, and he made it seem like not only Breece Hall thought that Adams was going to coming to New York, but several of his teammates did as well. Now, Adams on the receiver series on Netflix could be heard on the sideline saying, I need to get out of here before I get killed. Now, you can interpret that any number of different ways. And it doesn't sound like he wants to leave Las Vegas. Now, the question here, JJ, is and I have to go back and look, but I don't really remember Davante Adams going as low as he is in the Fantasy Pros Championship right now. This is the lowest I've seen him in an FFPC draft in quite a while. Shout out to Fantasy Mojo, fantasymojo.com, Darren Armani, who gives us this ADP data. Davante Adams is now going at the 210. This is Marvin Harrison, Drake London, Chris Olave territory. When you look at what Davante Adams has accomplished over the course of his career, when you look at what he did last year without Derek Carr, and then when you look at what he's going to do this year, whether it's O'Connell or whether it's Minshew, the 210, does that seem, we'll Goldilocks it here, too high, too low, just right? How do you feel about Davante Adams at the 210 right now?
Look, I think it's probably just right. You look at sort of the second round and how it's shaped up. Especially on like some other formats where the non-tight end premium type formats and stuff too. It's just it's a mess from the standpoint of it's not very clear, right? There's not that much clarity after Garrett Wilson-ish, and you could even argue that he might be even part of this giant tier of guys who we wouldn't be that shocked if any of them end up as wide receiver ones this year. And yeah, I mean, like, I think that he's properly valued because yes, the upside is he's Davante Adams. The downside is, obviously you have some inexperience at quarterback / maybe Gardner Minshew. It sounds like Aiden O'Connell is the one leading the charge there right now. Right. And so a little bit of inexperience there. They add Brock Bowers, so they add another piece of that offense where some target share might be shifted around a little bit. But also I think this offense is one that, first off, the Raiders defense is not that bad. And so that combined with an offense and an offensive philosophy and a team philosophy that's likely to be kind of ground and pound. And this does not mean that I'm into Zamir White for what it's worth, but a philosophy that likely will play a little conservatively, maybe not air it out that much. And game script might not actually favor, the offense throwing it a lot as much as people think, because I don't think the defense is really that bad. And so, especially with the coaching staff and the way that it's set up and how they performed during the second half of last year. So yeah, it's Davante Adams. And like you look at his peripherals last year, they were still really strong. I don't think that this is a situation where, we're going to see this like age curve hit and all of a sudden he's going to fall off. But I do think that it's understandable from a situation standpoint as to why he's kind of being lumped in with a lot of those other wide receivers right now.
You bring up the fact that they could be a conservative offense this year, and Antonio Pierce obviously being the head man there, you would think that, well, this could be something we look back on in October and think, well, obviously they were going to try to run the ball. We should have known this the whole time. And I think that the ADP price, it's baked in, right, to Adams in the tight end premium format, the FFPC to be going at the 210. But a team that's sort of on the flip side of that has not only, well, I shouldn't say this. They have shown us, have the Texans, that they not only want to throw the ball, they're really going to go out of their way to throw the ball this year with the acquisition of Stephon Diggs. And the big question here is with Houston, how do we handle this passing game? I'll bring up Nico Collins here because Aaron Wilson from KPRC2 just reported yesterday that Collins is expected to be ready to go when the Texans open training camp. I could be wrong. I think the Texans training camp for veterans opens up early next week. I'd have to double check that. However, the Texans did sign this guy to a 3-year, $72 million deal. 80 catches, 1,300 yards, 8 touchdowns last year in 15 games. obviously career highs all across the board. The question here is, what about Stephon Diggs? What about Tank Dell? What about maybe CJ Stroud punching above his weight last year? Maybe he comes back down to earth a little bit. And these are all important questions, JJ, because the Texans are not an offense that you can get on the cheap. You have to invest in this offense this year. You look at, I'll just go through it right now. Diggs going at the 4.11. These are all Fantasy Pros championship ADPs right now. Tank Dell, 5.12. Nico Collins, you have to pay up for at the 3.04. CJ Stroud, who we'll get into a little bit later, we'll focus on the receivers right now. But CJ Stroud also going very high in drafts right now. In fact, he is the QB 6th at the 7.09. How do you attack the Houston Texans receiver? You mentioned in your draft guide how important it is. I mean, I don't think any of these guys are outlier players, but longtime FFPC player David Hubbard always says, fantasy football is real simple. Just draft good players. Yeah. Well, who are the good players for the Texans receivers this year that we want to be in business with?
Yeah, I do think that you have to keep cost in mind here. I'm a little bit lower than the market on Nico, mostly because, I think people see what he did last year and like, well, Nico's a good player. Last year he had a 3.1 yards per route run rate. Obviously he put together a nice stat line. But if you look at the peripherals a little bit, I mean, like, a 21 to 22% target share per game rate is good, but it's not elite. Like that's a number that we're going to probably see 20 to 30 or at least like 20 wide receivers hit in 2024. And that's a little bit frightening when you add a piece like Stephon Diggs to that offense, when, Nico Collins for a lot of the year, or at least a chunk of the year, they weren't using Tank Dell to start the season, as a full-time guy. And then obviously he got hurt. So that's a target share in an offense with Dalton Schultz as his top competition. So I do worry a little bit about where that target share ceiling will come without injury, right? And now injury is obviously part of it. And I always talk about this and tell people that when you have contingent upside with multiple outs, which is what the case is here with Nico Collins, where, either Tank Dell or Stephon Diggs could get injured and be out a little bit. And if that happens, then sure, we might see like a 25% target share, maybe even higher in those scenarios. But I do think there's going to be a little bit of regression too, from the standpoint of how strong he was per route last year. Like a 3.1 yards per route run rate, it does tell us that it's like more than likely he's going to be good this year because he's a good player and he showed off last year and he showed us that he's a legit wideout in this league. But that's not a number that's really easily repeatable. I mean, we don't see wideouts get to that number year in and year out. And so my fear a little bit with Nico is that efficiency does drop a little bit. And when efficiency drops, what do you need? You need more volume. And is the volume going to be there when Stephon Diggs is entering the picture? So to me, I think it's fine, especially like in like a best ball format or something. I think it's totally different because we're probably going to see this like oscillation and a lot of ups and downs with these Texans wide receivers week in and week out. But from a managed league standpoint, you don't have that backbone of, okay, Nico had kind of a down week. Oh, we'll just throw one of these other 7 wide receivers that are in our lineup into the starting lineup because we're optimizing it based on performance, like in best ball. In a managed league, you don't get that luxury. And that's my fear for him in more of a managed format as opposed to, in a best ball one.
Yeah. And if you draft the Texans, you just want pieces of this offense, right? And in a managed league, it gets a little bit more dicey. And that's my whole thing this all of drafting season. It's if you want to be in business with the Texans receivers, you better pick the right one because these are you could still rebound, but man, those are high picks that if you miss on them, you're kind of behind the 8 ball a little bit with the rest of your league for sure. The 49ers wide receiver situation has been an interesting one to say the least since the Super Bowl. Deebo Samuel, the subject of trade rumors. They go out and draft Ricky Pearsall, and now Brandon Aiyuk has gone out and requested a trade. This is something that the Niners said that they won't meet. They have no interest in dealing them. The two sides tried to come together to come to an agreement. They couldn't. Aiyuk was an all-pro last year. He wants to be one of the highest-paid receivers in the NFL. I don't think the Niners believe he is one of the best receivers in the NFL, which is why they don't want to give him that money. Still a really good player, and I keep waiting for him to fall in drafts, JJ, and I'm not seeing it right now. 311 is where he's going. Mike Evans, Michael Pittman, Deebo Samuel in that same range at that 3-4 turn. How have you been handling Aiyuk in your drafts this year, knowing that, yeah, there's some uncertainty here, but the CBA only allows for a little bit of movement here of what Aiyuk can actually do to try to get his way.
Yeah, look, I was hoping that there would be some movement because realistically, if you if you look at the landscape of the league, Aiyuk going to 90 to 95% of teams, maybe even more. It's like if he like a realistic landing spot, let's say Buffalo is probably the one spot where maybe his fantasy value would increase. Maybe. I mean, I don't think it would even be that dramatic because of what Joe Brady showed us last year after he took over in Buffalo and how run heavy they were. Like there's not that much volume to go around in the passing offense in Buffalo, at least what we've seen, over the last couple of years with Josh Allen. And so, Buffalo would be fine. It would at least be a neutral move for Aiyuk. But if the two teams that are strongest linked to Aiyuk right now are Pittsburgh and Washington. If he goes to either of those places, he's going to drop by like a round in ADP probably, right? Like it's not a good situation. They're both going to be probably pretty run heavy. You got a rookie quarterback in Jaden Daniels. You have some competition there too with Terry McLaurin. And then in Pittsburgh, you have an Arthur Smith offense that's going to run the ball a lot and be fairly conservative. And then there's George Pickens too to compete with a little bit. And so I do think that from a guy like Aiyuk, yeah, he's not going to see that much volume in San Francisco because that team is likely to be good. We're going to see positive game scripts. They like to run the ball. But he can still be so uber efficient in that offense as we've seen in that offense over the last handful of years with Kyle Shanahan. And so I've been waiting for that ADP to fall and it hasn't. And so as a result of that, just because there is an out. Now, look, I think there's like a 95% chance, if not more, that Brandon Aiyuk is a 49er next year because the 49ers have no incentive, to trade him for a pick. I mean, I saw the rumor about like him going to Vegas or something and then Davante Adams going to San Francisco and all like those kinds of, that's wish casting. I mean, that kind of thing and that kind of conversation happens every single year. And those kinds of deals generally never come to fruition. Right. San Francisco's in a spot where they need to win right now. They can still keep him. He's under contract. And so there's no reason for them to look to the future right now, even though they did go out and draft Ricky Pearsall. The Pearsall pick to me was a 2025 thing because they have two wide receivers right now who could be hypothetically gone in 2025. Mm-hmm. So they needed something there. So I do think that there's a strong possibility that Aiyuk is still a 49er. I'd say it's at 95%, if not more. But usually in these situations, man, like we usually see some movement in ADP and we just haven't. Like to me, there's just not a big enough reason to go after him in this moment, in this like 2 to 3 week window, because that ADP hasn't shifted. If we were getting a discount, it would be a little bit of a different story.
Now, here's the other thing to weigh in on this. Let's say Aiyuk, he reports, he says, I'm going to play, I'll deal with my deal after the season. We'll figure out what team I'm going to play on that. I'm an Niner this year. I'm focused on winning a Super Bowl. 311, wide receiver 17. I don't even know if he bumps up that much.
Right.
I don't know if you get the warm fuzzies taking Aiyuk earlier than he was right now. And I think, as you just expounded upon in regards to Washington or Pittsburgh, who could get him, or who are the two teams that might be most likely to get him. If you have Aiyuk on your team right now, you want him to stay in San Francisco. You don't want him going elsewhere. This is as good as it gets for 2024, for sure. And I think that's I keep looking for something here, and there may not be anything here as far as Aiyuk goes. It's just 3-4 turn, and this is what he's going to be through September.
Yeah.
Let's go talk about another receiver in the same division, and that's Jackson Smith-Njigba in Seattle. Now, JJ, I know you played Dynasty with the FFPC. You have one of those Pros versus Joe's Dynasty squads there. Jackson Smith-Njigba was a guy who was going at the 102 or 103 in almost all FFPC rookie drafts last year. Underwhelmed, 6.4 yard ADOT last year, super low. That was under Shane Waldron, who's no longer the offensive coordinator there. Ryan Grubb, who actually was the OC for the Washington Huskies last year with Michael Penix and Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan and Roma Dunze and all those guys that were just throwing the ball all over the place and piling up yardage. JSN says he loves what he's seeing from the new offense so far. Now, Jackson Smith-Njigba, as you would think, has tumbled down the ADP to where I think a lot of people thought he was going to be this year, taking a step forward. It hasn't happened yet. And, it hasn't happened because the season hasn't started, but the ADP has not changed to a point where you would think that, okay, he's too rich for my blood. Yeah. Wide receiver 42, at the 806. This is Keon Coleman. This is DeAndre Hopkins territory there. Smith-Njigba as the number 2, the number 3 option in Seattle. How do you see that? And how are you attacking the Seattle receivers, specifically Smith-Njigba this year under a brand new offensive coordinator and head coach?
Yeah, I think that this Grubb offense could be interesting because, a lot of people think that it's just going to be this pass-heavy offense and stuff. You got to layer on personnel whenever you look at that kind of thing. Like you just mentioned, 3 top 100 pick wide receivers in that Washington team. I think Jalen McMillan was top. I mean, he was a round 3 guy, so I'm assuming he was top 100. 3 top 100 round pick or 100 top 100 picks out of those 3 wide receivers. You have Michael Penix, who was a first rounder. You had an offense that, why would you in college football against inferior competition, when you have 3 professional wide receivers and a professional quarterback, why would you not throw the ball all around the field, right? So I don't think that's just going to translate to Seattle, because Seattle has 3 good wide receivers too. I don't think that's the logical thing to think. Not only that, but they have a defensive minded head coach now, where I think they're going to want to have a little bit more balance offensively. The thing that I think is going to change is 2. I think that, we saw this a little bit in college where he would run tempo and change tempo throughout a game. Like it wasn't just a consistent, we're going to go fast. He changes tempo based on what that offense needs to do based on game environment and game situation, which is smart. And then also, I think we're going to see more deep shots. Like Geno Smith is very good at getting the ball down the field. Last year, part of the reason why that offense wasn't able to do what it did 2 years ago, Geno Smith only had 4 touchdowns on his 15-plus air yard throws last year. 2 years ago, that number was 14 touchdowns. There was 10 more on those types of passes. And, JSN was one of the guys who really, really got hurt by that with his low ADOT last year, in that Waldron offense. So I think this could be the year where not only we see more deep shots in Seattle, we might see more plays run. Like Seattle's actually been a fairly pass-heavy team when you look at pass rate over the last couple of years, but they haven't had that many pass attempts because they've been inefficient and they've been kind of slow. Like they haven't been able to get much volume in terms of like plays run in that offense. I think we're going to see a little bit more plays run. We're going to see more deep shots. It might be a little bit more balanced than it has in terms of pass rate over the last couple of years. But with Tyler Lockett kind of taking his yards per route run was a little bit lower than what we've seen over the last 6 years or so, getting up there in age a little bit. It wouldn't surprise me if this is a year where we see the transfer of Lockett becoming more of the 3 and JSN becoming more of the 2. And as a result of that, JSN not being a horrible pick at his current ADP.
The other thing that that sticks in my mind about Lockett, the Seattle did just give him an extension. It wasn't a long extension, but they did reinvest in him. And the first thing I think of is like, okay, what does this say about Smith-Njigba? Not necessarily Metcalf, but what does this say for Smith-Njigba? But it could just be the fact like, okay, we have Ryan Grubbs running things now. We want to throw. We want to make sure these guys are here longer than this year. We want to keep them around. We want to make sure that we're able to attack. And I understand like there's still Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet there, which we'll get into for sure coming up later on in the program. But I think that the Smith-Njigba thing is interesting. Wide receiver 42 right now. And if you get that right, that could pay off dividends down the road for your teams this year. Regarding the draft guide, there's a lot of stuff in there about historically how players have done, certain types of players, archetypes, have done over the course of the, let's say, the last 5 years in the NFL. There's an interesting player in Green Bay named Dontayvion Wicks, who was a 5th-round pick in 2023, ended up getting 39 catches, just under 600 yards, 4 touchdowns. He got another touchdown in the postseason last year. Jordan Love was doing an AMA video with Bleacher Report and said that he was asked, well, who's your breakout? Who's going to be a breakout this year? And he mentioned Dontayvion Wicks first, talked about him quite a bit. And then later on, he mentioned Jaden Reed kind of as an aside. But JJ, the thing that makes Wicks so interesting is he's not a unicorn. That's the wrong term. But he's a player that I think had things gone his way in the 2022 season in college, he would have been a much higher pick than the 5th round. You think about a new quarterback and a new OC, he was dinged up a little bit, new head coach. There was so much new stuff there, and he was coming off a monster year the year before, and then that knocks him down in the draft to the 5th round. I think if people had to do it over again, Dontayvion Wicks is for sure a day 2 pick. And I look at this player as having all the talent in the world. The problem is Jordan Love's favorite receiver in Green Bay seems to be the open one, and Wicks might be 5th on the pecking chart. And if you want to include Josh Jacobs, he might even be lower than that. You have to sink a 13th round pick in the Fantasy Pros Championship to get Wicks on your squad this year. And I think it's interesting because you see the upside, but you're also understanding, you have to also understand that this guy might be a better best ball player than a redraft player. And that's where the confusion sets in on Wicks.
Yeah, I think that you're probably right. Like in the end, this Green Bay wide receiving core is probably a better in best ball type group, right? Where we might see a rotation like we did last year, where it's just going to be pretty unpredictable week in and week out. I think though that if we're placing bets on players that could emerge and be like, you got to keep them on the field because they're that good, I think Jayden Reed would be number 1 because he was, to me, he was a really, really good prospect. He came out last year. He had the best yards per route run on the team. He's versatile. I think that people sort of are typecasting him as putting him in this archetype of being a slot guy, but he can play inside out and he can do Deebo Samuel-like things too out of the backfield. And so I think there's a lot of upside in Jayden Reed and what he does. But with Wicks, he was over that 2.0 yards per route run rate number, which has only been accomplished by 26 rookies since 2011. And if you look at that list of rookies, it's good rookie after good rookie after good rookie. Now, a lot of those rookies who got there also had the backbone of being like unquestionably good prospects, right? Mm-hmm. Like they were first rounders, top half of the first round type picks. And I think the most interesting thing with Wicks, and this goes back to some of the draft guide stuff where I look at market trends and ADP trends, and I sort of put these like stories together. But like when it comes to middle round wide receivers, I define them as like wide receiver 25 to wide receiver 42. So this is more of like the Jayden Reed range and such. Those wide receivers who had previous season high yards per route run, they're very good targets usually the following season. So previous season, good yards per route run, good efficiency, target them out of the middle rounds because they generally then do well. The interesting thing is that when you get a late round wide receiver who has really good previous season peripherals, they don't hit at nearly as good of a rate as those middle round guys do. And I'm saying hitting versus ADP expectation. This isn't just hitting in general, right? Because obviously late round picks are going to be worse than middle round picks. This is versus expectation and where they're being drafted. And I think the reason for that is the market is kind of telling you that if you're a late round pick, despite having good peripherals, there might be a reason why you're still a late round pick. So with Wicks, I've still been drafting Wicks. Don't get me wrong. Like he's still a player to target for me, all that good stuff. But I'm more interested to see how his ADP changes from now through draft season, because all the ADP analysis I do is based on locked ADP and summer ADP, right? So if his ADP rises and maybe Jayden Reed's falls a little bit and Christian Watson falls a little bit and Romeo Doubs maybe stays the same or even falls a little bit and Wicks is the riser, then all of a sudden he's going to enter this range where the market is more confident in him. And that matters. I know that a lot of people think that like ADP data and what the market's doing doesn't matter because people are stupid. But it's really, there's a lot of reason to follow what the masses are conveying and saying. And in this case, that's one of those situations where I think he's very easy to draft in best ball, especially with like a Jordan Love stack. But even in a managed league, I think you can still throw that dart because he's so cheap. But it's odd because I'd almost feel more confident in him if the market feels more confident in him, if that makes sense. It's a really backwards like way of thinking, because usually we want the cheaper guys. Like we want them to stay cheap and get cheaper if we really like them. But this is one of those dynamics where, if the market starts realizing how good he is and he starts rising, then those previous season peripheral numbers kind of have more credit than they would have otherwise.
I think that's the other thing I like about that draft guide is how much you're not investing, but how much stock you put into like, okay, well, this is what I think. This is what the numbers show. What does Fantasy Nation think? What do the rest of the drafters think? And I think that's an important thing to understand as we unpack and we go through, these last 6 weeks of drafting season or whatever it is until the start of the NFL season. Man, it's coming up fast. The other, or one of the other offenses that I think is really compelling this year, and I'm not saying it's going to be good, I'm not saying it's going to be bad, but I think it's a very interesting story, is Cleveland. Last year, Joe Flacco came in off the couch and put up a ton of numbers. Some of those numbers were interceptions, but he pumped the ball downfield. He made David Njoku great. Amari Cooper had some really, really good games. You think about that championship round game he had. It was unbelievable. And they go out and get Jerry Jeudy this year as well. So the pieces are there in Cleveland. I have no – I mean, I'll let you talk about Nick Chubb if you want. I basically have no faith in this guy. I know he was just squatting, 500 pounds the other day, but this is a young man's game. JJ, I can't remember who I was talking to about this the other day, but you remember the knee injury he had last year and how vicious that looked. And then I was kind of like, well, you know, at least he'll have the whole season and the whole off season to recover. And then we already hear, you know, stuff trickle out a few weeks after the knee injury. Oh, it's not as serious as we thought. It's going to be, the cleanup is going to be a lot better. That's great. And all this stuff we hear positive, it's super positive. And then all of a sudden, I can't remember which reporter from the Browns dropped it, but they said, Nick Chubb, no timetable to return. Yeah. Where did that come from? Yeah. We heard nothing but good things. Then all of a sudden, and he was obviously the linchpin of that Browns running game. Now, if that doesn't work, just Deshaun Watson's going to have to really come through in a way he has not done in a Browns uniform yet. He said he's great, and this is the player talking about his own injury, which I always obviously take with a grain of salt. But he said his shoulder injury is good. He didn't say whether he is going to be cleared for the start of camp in time, but this is an injury that he has been rehabbing most of the offseason. They do have Jameis Winston there, which I think is interesting. The way that Joe Flacco was throwing the ball last year, it reminded me a lot of how Jameis Winston plays the quarterback position in the NFL. And the Deshaun Watson aspect of, okay, how is this guy going to perform? That affects Amari Cooper. That affects Jeudy. That affects Elijah Moore. That affects Njoku. It affects all these guys. And so when you look at Deshaun Watson this year, what kind of year is he going to have? And as a result, what are your feelings on that Cleveland offense in general?
Yeah, I'm pretty bullish on both, at least versus cost, right? I'm not drafting Deshaun Watson as a top 12 quarterback. That's not what I'm saying. But even if you look at last year, in healthy games last year, his rate of getting to 20 plus points per game was a top 12 number at quarterback in the league. Some of that was because of his rushing ability, but that's the point, right? He still has at least some of that juice on the ground to be able to score on the ground and give you some of that. I also think what's really big for Cleveland this year, we might see a philosophical shift and them being sort of a run heavy. You know, we saw it with Joe Flacco a little bit down the stretch last year, sure, but we might see a shift of them being going from a run heavy offense to more of a spread offense. You look at all their moves, you know, they add Jerry Jeudy. They have a really good wide receiving core, hypothetically, right? I say hypothetically because we need to see more out of both Jeudy and Elijah Moore. But Njoku, one of the best receiving tight ends that you can find in the league, you know, all things considered. And then obviously Amari Cooper is an alpha. And they get Ken Dorsey. And Ken Dorsey has been a pass-friendly, pass-heavy coordinator throughout his time. And so I would not be surprised if we see a lot of spread from Cleveland. And then you add on top of that, they don't have Nick Chubb more than likely to start the season. And, you know, they have this combo of like a Jerome Ford, Deontay Foreman, you know, who's going to make the team or who's not going to make the team with like a Nyheim Hines, Pierre Strong. They don't have like an obvious, you know, they have the bruiser and Deontay Foreman, but why would they run their offense around Deontay Foreman when they have all these weapons through the air, right? And so I think that this could be a team that actually brings a lot of fantasy goodness to us because there could be a lot of passing. We know passing leads to more points and more fantasy points. And so I'm throwing the dart on Deshaun Watson as a QB2. You know, I think that the upside at least is there. I understand that he's been terrible, and I don't expect him to like be the Deshaun Watson of old. But I do think he can definitely outplay his ADP right now.
And the thing, and I think the big takeaway here is Watson will still keep Cooper and Njoku paying off at their current ADPs, right?
Yeah, I think all of them, like I've even been throwing, especially like if you're in a best ball draft right now and you're like, man, I don't have an easy stackable team, right? You know, and you're in like the whatever round and Jerry Jeudy's sitting there. I don't even mind going that route, just getting Jeudy, especially if you already drafted like you know, if you're in like a tournament environment where week 17 matters a lot and, you know, you got Jaylen Waddle early and they're playing Miami week 17, get Jeudy, get Watson. And then, you know, you could even throw like a Deontay Foreman in late too, and just get a little bit of a Brown stack going. I don't mind that at all. I think that they're all reasonably priced and I think you should get exposure to most of them.
We'll stay in the the state of Ohio for this last one. Mike Gesicki, a new Cincinnati Bengal this year. Paul Dehner Jr., who covers the Bengals for The Athletic, said that Gesicki is his fantasy breakout candidate. 700 yards in back-to-back seasons in 2022 and 2021 and 2022. 73 passes in 2022. Mike McDaniel gets there, and it was a different story, obviously. But now, apparently, he is going to be could be used in the big slot role according to Dehner Jr. For the Bengals this year. Tight end premium leagues. This is why we care about this guy, and he's going in the 17th round right now. JJ, how much stock are you putting in? Again, this is a beat writer talking about fantasy football. Again, we don't necessarily want to put all our chips in on something like that, but this is interesting, and the fact that he's going so late. Is Gesicki representing a guy that you want to look at later in your FFPC drafts?
Yeah, look, the nice part about this is you can hedge it pretty easily, and in an offense that's going to be pass heavy, that has a lot of firepower and potential. And by hedge, I mean, they drafted Jermaine Burton, who I think is a really good prospect, who I'm excited for. The only reason why Jermaine Burton was a 3rd round pick is because of off the field stuff. Like he could have potentially been a late 1st round pick had he not had some of these things going on off the field that teams were worried about. And to me, Burton, he was a field stretcher in college. He was someone that can definitely get down the field. He can play all over the field, though. One of the comps in my model was Robert Woods, but he's got more speed than Robert Woods does. But a guy who's just versatile, can play all over the field. Now, the way that I kind of saw this Bengals offense working this year with Burton and no Tyler Boyd this was an opportunity for them in 3 wide sets and 11 personnel to get Jamar Chase in the slot more, right? And to get him these easy matchups. We know that he can be a monster. And if you get Chase there, you create these mismatches, have Burton on the perimeter, being able to stretch the field, and then have T. Higgins on the perimeter as well. I think that's a pretty lethal combination with those 3. Now, could Gesicki end up just playing a slot role instead of using the 3 wideouts in 11 personnel? Sure. Now, the nice part is that Burton goes pretty late. Gesicki goes pretty late. And so you can, if you're playing more than one league, you can hedge this pretty easily, right? You could say, what if Gesicki is the primary slot dude in 11? Or what if Burton is on the field more? And then obviously Burton has that contingent upside of Chase or Higgins getting injured and getting more work. So I think there's a situation where I've been drafting both of them all offseason, all summer, and I'm going to continue to do that. This only makes me feel more bullish about, getting Gesicki in the last round, one of the last rounds, as opposed to kind of being like, he hasn't been that great, of late over the last couple of years. Gesicki, even his peripheral numbers, it hasn't just been scheme related. And he's always been just kind of a slot guy. Like he's not a traditional tight end, which is one of the reasons why I don't think using like how he performed in Miami with Mike McDaniel after not doing anything in Miami really tells us that much about like Jonnu Smith this year, because Jonnu Smith is not even close to the same kind of tight end as Mike Gesicki. Gesicki is kind of a slot guy, right? So it makes sense to do this. I just think that there's also this out that Jermaine Burton is involved in this offense in some way too.
The Pros versus Joes competition for the FFPC will get underway this Sunday. JJ Zachariason is not drafting in it this Sunday, but he is drafting in it the following Sunday. We'll have coverage right here in the Better Sports Network of it. I do want to bring up one of the Joes that is drafting in the FFPC Pros versus Joes in your league, actually. JJ, you're drafting 7th. Our good buddy Sean Green, who's hanging out in the YouTube chat right now, he's drafting 4th in that draft on the 28th, and he brings up, Are we worried about that Joe Burrow wrist injury? And I think this is interesting because you mentioned drafting Burton and Gesicki late. However, the investment that we would be concerned about is Higgins, is Chase, is Burrow. How concerned are you with Joe Burrow's wrist injury coming into this season?
It's one of those things where I lean on the people who study that stuff more and better than I do. And the people that do don't seem overly concerned about it right now. And so I'm not going to be overly concerned about it. The thing too is that like I know that this is the injury that he suffered second, it was a calf to start the season. And he was just like totally not Joe Burrow to start last year. And then there was that 1 month, that glimpse of classic Burrow dominating football and fantasy football before he then ended up getting hurt with his wrist. And so I'm looking at that and I'm saying, imagine him doing that throughout the entire season without a solidified run game. They invest at wide receiver. They invest in Mike Gesicki. This could be a really, really pass heavy offense. And I'm intrigued by that with Burrow. So I'm still bullish on the passing attack in Burrow, mostly because, again, like I said, all these doctors who look at this stuff and can actually analyze it, unlike me, who's sitting in my mom's basement. I'm not one that's going to be able to say yes or no there, but they're saying that they're optimistic.
We will not ask JJ Zachariason for any more medical advice. However, we will ask him for where he stands on certain players, including Jaylen Waddle, Rasheed Shaheed, and more. You're watching the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. He's JJ Zachariason, lateround.com. I'm Eric Balkman from the FFPC. We roll on right after this.
Is Dynasty. And the place to play is myffpc.com. Go to myffpc, use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more. Now is the time to get in there and get set up with a startup draft. Now is the time, now that the rookies and everyone are set, because you can go in and you can start the draft and, you draft your Justin Jeffersons and Jamar Chases. And now that we know where the rookies are and where they're landing, you get going on that. So you want to try and set a startup draft for this week coming up if you're not involved yet. So go get involved. Use the QR code here or use the promo code that's in the link in the description here and get yourself going on Dynasty so you can really enjoy these players and draft the players you believe in. If you like Michael Penix Jr., you got to play Dynasty because you got to wait for him, but the payoff is big. And same with like Pearsall and Jackson Smith-Njigba and all these guys. Get in and do that. And I'll tell you what, the orphan leagues over there that we've been talking about, those all got bought up. They're actually all sold. People from this show I know took over a bunch of them. So right now, startups is the way to go. That's the way to rock and roll. It is startup season. Startup season and rookie draft season. That's what's up. Get set up at myffpc.com. Use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more and give you a leg up. No dealing with chasing around your friends and making them pay dues and having your buddy be like, oh, dude, I got to quit the league because I got a dog and I can't pay attention no more and I don't want to do trades. Forget all that. You can play online, MyFFPC, high stakes, low stakes, whatever you want to do with experts. And if somebody leaves the league, it goes in that orphan pool and somebody picks it up. The league has never been disbanded on FFPC.com. That's directly from Eric Balkman over there. Has told me that. So that's what's up. Get set up.
We've been talking a lot of best ball action here on the show tonight. If you're looking for a couple of best ball tournaments to join, look no further than myffpc.com. Our best ball tournament features a $300,000 grand prize, $125 to enter. Don't forget, you can also play in our Superflex best ball tournament for a $100,000 grand prize at just a $35 entry fee. Both of those first place prizes, as well as the prize pools, deeper than they were in 2023. Check it out. myffpc.com, myffpc.com. Talking with JJ Zachariason, hanging out with the late round man himself. You listen to the Living the Stream podcast with him and Denny Carter. When is that coming back, by the way, JJ?
Yeah, we'll kick it back off in August probably. He's out in Greece right now. He's been in Greece for like 2.5 weeks, living his life. But yeah, I've been focused, on the late round podcast and just doing that, throughout the off season and stuff. We usually take a break since it is focused mostly on streaming and stuff. That's just an in-season type thing.
Yeah, and which makes perfect sense too.
Yeah.
And the Late Round podcast found anywhere you get your podcast for sure as well. Let's find out where you stand on certain players. I noticed on the X there was a little bit of an incident with Derrick Henry, and I'll listen. You want to get into that as much as you can. I know it's all in good fun. But Henry's an interesting cat because he's an older running back, JJ. But he's on the best team he's ever played for, probably. He's playing behind the best offensive line that he's ever had, probably. And maybe the best quarterback in front of him that he's ever had as well. Derrick Henry right now in the FFPC Fantasy Pros Championship. ADP on him right now is, why can I not find this in front of me? Derrick Henry is running back 7 at the 210. Where do you stand on this aging Titan that could still be pretty big in 2024?
Look, I've officially not taken a strong stance on Derrick Henry this season. Last year I had him as a fade, which actually wasn't that bad of a call, but I've been pretty bad at understanding what Derrick Henry is going to do on a football field, whether in season or out of season. He's just been the bane of my analysis existence. But yeah, I mean, like, I think that if you look at the situation, Baltimore last year, they had the third most rushing touchdowns at running back. That does not even include Lamar Jackson. So the scoring opportunity should be there to some degree. I do think there's going to be some regression because usually we see when a team does really, really well offensively, it's just hard to maintain that kind of prowess, right? But they did have the fourth most fantasy points as a group, and that's a running back group that wasn't that overly talented, didn't have a Derrick Henry type player in it. But the downside here is age, right? And Derrick Henry hasn't necessarily been the same back that he was 2 or 3 years ago. You know, no year 9+ running back who's been drafted in the first 3 rounds since 2011 has outperformed his ADP expectation. Now I'm going to reference ADP expectation a lot, throughout the show. It's basically, think about every draft slot in a particular league will have some sort of expectation in points per game at each position. This is just based on what's gone on historically, based on trend lines and such. So obviously expectation is a lot higher in the first round than the 4th round and the 7th round. So if you look at the first 3 rounds and you just look at where these year 9+ running backs have been drafted, none of them have exceeded expectation, have been better than what we expected at their ADP since 2011. I don't know the exact number of the sample size. I don't remember, but it's not massive, but it's also not like incredibly small. And I think that that's the downside with Henry. So you kind of combine those two forces, and I say, I'm at market with Derrick Henry this year. I'm not getting into that. I'm not gonna, it's Derrick Henry. Like he's beaten probability. He's been an outlier. It's going to continue. And the nice part about Baltimore, the other thing I'll say about this, the nice part about Baltimore is they're likely not going to have high running back target shares to begin with, which is fine for Derrick Henry because we don't expect that anyway. So I do think the fit is exactly what he's needed and what's best for him from a fantasy perspective. So I think he's fine where he's going, at least within the running back position.
One of the other things I noticed in the draft guide, which you can get at lateround.com right now, is talking about these really, really talented elite receivers that just happen to be the number 2 receiver on their team because they have a player in front of them that commands more targets, maybe is more talented, gets looked at by the quarterback more. And one of those players, again, this year is Jaylen Waddle, who is dealing with Tyreek Hill. Yet, FFPC players are still drafting him at the 305. He's smack dab between Nico Collins and Cooper Kupp. Can you talk a little bit about what you found out about the players that fit the type of, the archetype that Jaylen Waddle is, and where you stand on him as as a mid-3rd round pick in FFPC leagues this year?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are scared off when they get a number 2 option on a team, in the first 3 rounds of their draft or what have you. I looked at wide receiver 2s, so wide receiver 13 to 24. I kind of clustered them up since 2014. Did the same with wide receiver 1s, obviously, too, and that's kind of how I analyze things. But with these wide receiver 2s, when they were the second option on their team, like a Devonte Smith, like a Jaylen Waddle, I know last year it didn't work out that well for people or as well for people, but historically, those guys have actually been really, really good in fantasy football. They've beaten expectation at a higher rate than the alternative has. And so I don't think that means that you have to seek them out. I think it means that you should not use that as an excuse to not draft those guys. Like, think about like a Roddy White back in the day, right? Or, when he was playing with like Julio. There are many, many examples of these players actually being pretty good. And I think the reason why they're good is twofold. It's because people are pushing them down in ADP because of this fear that they're not the number 1 on their team. But also there is this contingent upside, which you get with Jaylen Waddle too. If Tyreek Hill goes down, Jaylen Waddle could see a 30% target share in this offense and no one would blink, right? It didn't happen, obviously. And we haven't seen that really happen. But, even despite that, Jaylen Waddle throughout his 3 years in the league, he's ranked 15th, 11th, and 21st in PPR points per game at wide receiver. And that's basically where he's being drafted right now is around his floor. Like, it's not far off from his floor, like realistically. Last year, he was still in the 94th percentile in yards per route run, 92nd percentile in targets per route run. His numbers were better in 2023 than in 2022. He just didn't score as many touchdowns. He didn't have as much fortune there, but his peripherals were better. And yet his ADP has fallen year over year because of injury, really, is what it comes down to. So to me, because of the market trends, because of all that, because of the contingent upside, Jaylen Waddle is actually one of my favorite clicks in the early rounds this year.
Jaylen Waddle, a click, a target for JJ Zachariason. You know, I was having visions when you mentioned Roddy White, a player I hadn't thought about in a long time. Yeah. Roddy White and Julio Jones just running down the field with using these massive catch radiuses to suck in all these great passes from the quarterbacks that Atlanta had back then. You know, think about Matt Ryan and piling up all the yardage. And I'm wondering if we might see not a repeat, but part deux, so to speak, in Atlanta this year with Kirk Cousins, Drake London, and then Jimmy Williams hanging out on YouTube right now. He wants to know your thoughts on the Falcons saying Kyle Pitts is learning wide receiver routes in the offense too. And if you look at Kyle Pitts this year, JJ, tight end premium scoring in the FFPC Fantasy Pros Championship, 401 as tight end 7. Where do you stand on a player like him? Is this a player that you've taken a strong stance on? Or are you kind of letting, just going with the market on this one?
Yeah, I think he's fine. It's mostly a market pick for me. I mean, there's some trends that definitely don't favor him. We can talk about it a little bit later with like a Dalton Kincaid, but I'll just say it now. Like one of the craziest trends that I found in the draft guide was with tight ends and looking at previous season numbers for tight ends. So this might be a little bit confusing to hear on a podcast, so bear with me. But if you look at top 12 tight ends in the current season, and you look at how they performed in the previous season, and they have to have played 8 games in both the current season and the previous season. Mm-hmm. The guys in the previous season who failed to hit 10 PPR points per game, none of them in history since 2014 scored 10 PPR points per game in the current season. And so the 2 tight ends that fits this year, aside, in the high end range, are Dalton Kincaid and Kyle Pitts. It also fits for like a Dallas Goedert as well. Now the difference is that number is skewed pretty tremendously by the current season tight ends being lower end tight end ones, right? So they're guys that the previous season, they didn't score 10 PPR points per game, and then they're drafted as like the tight end 10, right? The difference is that Dalton Kincaid and Kyle Pitts are high end tight end ones. There's only been 2 of those since 2014. One of them actually, I think, was Kyle Pitts. The other was Darren Waller last year. And obviously this ADP depends on source and all that kind of stuff. Like you're going to see ADP fluctuations. It's just the general idea that is the most important, is that there is a carryover both in yards per route run, which neither guy hit last year either, and points per game. And so there is that red flag for those guys for me to say enough, because I think that going that direction makes sense, but and like going the tight end direction makes sense. But I'm more inclined to go with some of the other guys at tight end ahead of them and drafting them at cost, as opposed to like a Kincaid and Pitts where they go. And the other thing with the wide receiver stuff, I don't want Kyle Pitts to play wide receiver. I just want Kyle Pitts to create mismatches in this 11 personnel offense and dominate the middle of the field and just play tight end at do what Travis Kelce does. You know what I mean? Like right. We want that kind of environment for him because it's going to be more advantageous from a matchup standpoint. Right. And so it's fine. Like it can't hurt that he's like getting reps at wide, and he's done that. He did that throughout Arthur Smith's time there too. But I don't think it's necessarily like this is a great thing for Kyle Pitts, because it could be a bad thing as well. Like I think it's more neutral than anything else.
And it could be. I mean, this could be a big nothing burger like it was last year. And, right. And Kyle Pitts too has fallen. I think he was going higher. I always say he's the most polarizing tight end in FFPC history, because it seems like everybody either hates him or loves him every single year. And this is another year where his ADP is it's as low as it's been in quite some time. But we'll see how it happens or how it goes this year for him in London, in Atlanta, with passes being thrown by Kirk Cousins. I want to jump around here. I'm going to flip ahead to the Titans backfield here, JJ, and talk a little bit about Tyjae Spears v. Tony Pollard. 806 and 810 is where they're going right now. That's running back 29, running back 31. It's Pollard, and then it's Spears. This is similar to the Pittsburgh situation with Harris and Warren. Harris is still going ahead of Warren, and Pollard's going ahead of Spears. Yet it seems like everybody I talk to likes Warren better than Harris. They like Spears better than Pollard, and yet the ADPs don't reflect that. I don't know what's going on there, but where do you stand on the Titans backfield this year?
Yeah, I like Spears more than Pollard, but I think that they're kind of back to back. I don't have like this obvious, you got to get Spears, but it depends on where you're drafting too. Like this ADP has shrunk. There was a bigger gap. Like people were into Tony Pollard even more. And I feel like it's definitely gotten to a point where at least the general vibes around the backfield, people are coming around more on Tajay Spears. And it's interesting because like people hated Tony Pollard last year. Like what happened to that? I thought people didn't like Tony Pollard. And you look at the dynasty community with Tajay Spears before they signed Tony Pollard, Spears was like an RB1 in dynasty before all that went down. And so it's just interesting that Pollard is the guy that folks are favoring. If you look at market trends, year 2 backs have better hit rates in that range than guys that are past year 5 of their NFL career, which is what you get with Pollard. And I think Tajay Spears is just good. I mean, if you look at his target share per game last year, it's the 6th best target share per game of any rookie running back since 2011. Here are the names who are better than him: Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, Alvin Kamara, Bijan Robinson, and Tariq Cohen. Those are the only 5. And Tariq Cohen, you might be like, oh, that's a bad name on the list. Yeah. He was the RB15 in PPR formats in year 2. So I like what Tennessee is doing. I'm very, that's probably the one offense that I'm most bullish on versus cost right now. And so been drafting a lot of them. I think they're going to throw the ball and air it out a lot. People think that's might be a bad thing for the running backs. But I think in Spears' case in particular, it could be a really good thing because he might be able to capture a decent target share in the offense.
I think that's the thing to keep in mind too is we envisioned Tony Pollard once Ezekiel Elliott left Dallas. We envisioned Tony Pollard as being like, I know people that said that, first round pick, maybe first overall pick, now that he doesn't have to contend with Elliott. But that wasn't the type of player that he is in the NFL, or at least that's not how he performed. Now he's sort of back to a similar role, not the same role, but a similar role in Tennessee. And he is a talented pass catcher. And Will Levis maybe is the guy that we should be loving up on, because not only does he have 2 pass catching running backs, but he's got Hopkins, he's got Ridley, he's got Treylon Burks, he's got Chig Okonkwo there. Like all the weapons are there in Tennessee. And I'm with you. I think when you're talking about offenses to look at later on, all those guys, none of them have high investment costs with them. So it makes perfect sense to get in business with them. Jameson Williams, speaking of young receivers, apparently Dan Campbell says he's a man on a mission. He's been the most improved player since the start of spring practices. This is a guy that had trouble getting out of his own way, JJ, coming off the ACL tear in college. Then he had the gambling thing. It's just it's been one thing after another. And this finally, he gets the full off season. It looks like he's taking advantage, and he's playing on an offense that it's good that the fact that they throw the ball a ton. It's good that they put up a lot of points. It's good that they chew up a lot of yardage. Yet he's got to deal with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Sam Laporta there as well. Jameson Williams right now, his ADP sits at 10.05. He's wide receiver 49 in the FFPC. Where do you stand on him for a managed league?
Yeah, look, I'm not going to be super, super mad if someone wants to take him at wide receiver 49. It's not going to make or break your team per se. But I will say this. I know that he's had a different journey, and that's always the pushback is, he tore his ACL and he didn't really play year 1. And then, year 2, he was suspended. So things were a little bit different. I get all that, but I'll at least throw this at you. Okay. I have a prospect database that I use for my prospect model. There's over 500 wide receivers in it since 2011. It includes everyone who either went to the combine or who was drafted. So over 500 wide receivers since 2011 in that database who failed to get to 7 PPR points per game in year 1 and year 2. Of those 500 plus, now there's a lot of guys who went undrafted and never stepped foot on a football field. There's that kind of environment. I get it. So this 500 number, you could even say it's 100. It doesn't even matter. It'll still make the statistic, not favor Jameson Williams. But of the 500, none of them in year 3 hit 13 or more PPR points per game, and only 2 of them, Willie Snead and Nelson Aguilar, hit 12 PPR points per game. And so I understand Jameson Williams' path has been a little bit different, but I would feel differently about Williams had we seen anything in the peripheral numbers to suggest that he's a special talent. I liked him as a prospect. My model liked him as a prospect. We just can't just latch on to that forever and just assume that's the way it's going to be with Williams. And I do think that when players get off to a rough start to their NFL careers, it matters. It matters for look at a Mike Williams, for instance. It wasn't easy at the start of his career, and he never really got to, I know injuries have plagued him at times and stuff too. He just never really got to the point of being that superstar player that the talent was there and he just wasn't able to show it off because of him not being able to stay on the field. I do think that matters for development. I'm a little bit nervous about that. Had his yards per route run and targets per route run rates and all of the predictive peripheral stuff that we look at, had that been better, because that kind of stuff doesn't really matter from the standpoint of like playing tons and tons of games, right? Like he could play 4 games and run, X number of routes, 100 routes, and we can get some sort of sample size on it. But even that sample size has not been that good for Jameson Williams. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not like overly bullish, but again, I'm not going to like fault anyone if they want to take a stand and get a guy like that in the 10th round. Because it is at least the right kind of profile, I think, to throw a dart at in terms of, the prospect profile, the big playability, the offensive environment, all of that stuff is there. So I can understand throwing that dart. And there are other guys who, just don't have any upside that you're going to probably be taking around that range. But I'm still not that optimistic that he's going to really, really pan out.
And he may not. And I think that the thing is that he had, you mentioned how much you and your model liked Jameson Williams coming into the NFL. You guys who are drafted that early have to prove they can't play, right? And so then we as fantasy players oftentimes will give them a longer leash and say, maybe this is the year, maybe this is the year.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are saying, maybe this is the year again. All that stuff that you brought up, number one, I didn't know a lot of that. So thank you. Number two, the other thing is I just look at all these other guys on that Detroit offense that I do like quite a bit more. And it's difficult for me to say, okay, yeah, I'm going to take as my wide receiver 4 and my wide receiver 5, a guy who might be the 4th option on his own team,
right?
Or maybe even 5th. And that's the problem I have with it.
Yep.
Jameson Williams had a lot of pedigree. Rasheed Shaheed had no pedigree. He was an undrafted free agent for the Saints. And he is on a team right now that for the first time in a long time will not have Michael Thomas on it, at least right now. They have Chris Olave there. They have A.T. Perry. Outside of that, I don't know. Not a ton of difference-making pass catchers, but maybe Shaheed's one of them, and you can get him in the 12th round. He's going as a wide receiver 5 at wide receiver 57. J.J. Zachariason, where do you stand on Rasheed Shaheed?
I love Rasheed Shaheed. Especially from a best balls perspective, he'll give you a top 36 usable week number more than likely this year. But one of the things that's really strange that I feel like in the Shaheed discussion doesn't get talked about enough, Michael Thomas being gone actually does matter to some degree. When he was healthy last year, he had a 19% target share per game rate, which is not nothing. Like that's substantial considering Rasheed Shaheed hasn't gotten to 15% in either of his first 2 years in the league so far. So I think without Thomas, the lack of depth that they have there, I think we can project Shaheed for at least an 18-19% target share, which given the way that he's been used in his ADOT and getting down the field, that can be substantial from a fantasy perspective. The other thing is that Clint Kubiak is now offensive coordinator in New Orleans, and that's a huge, huge upgrade from what New Orleans is dealing with. They didn't run like any motion last year. They did nothing fun offensively. Kubiak's going to come over, from San Francisco, which by the way, he was the passing game coordinator, and San Francisco's passing attack was one of the best in football. Brock Purdy, a fringe MVP candidate last year, a 7% touchdown rate. He's going to get guys in motion. He's going to get guys open and scheme them open. And I think Rasheed Shaheed has the skill set to be a player who really benefits from something like that because he has the speed and ability to separate after the catch and make big plays. So I think he's a great pick where he's going. He's one of my highest roster players so far this at least at wide receiver so far this offseason. And I think he's fine in managed leagues too.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. This is a player that I've never been super excited about, but I look at all the pieces that are coming together there in New Orleans this year, and I think it really sets up for Rasheed Shaheed easily outperforming his current ADP. That may change, and he may move up over the course of the next 6 weeks, but right now he is a guy that you want to be in business with. Tyrone Tracy, final thing I'll bring up here in this segment here. Tyrone Tracy was a player that I know a lot of people were excited about prior to the NFL draft. He ends up landing in New York that does not have a backfield with Saquon Barkley anymore. You have Devin Singletary there. I know there's some high stakes players I've been talking to that they like Eric Gray quite a bit. Tyrone Tracy, while he may not be the guy ever, He probably won't be the guy this season, but he could be the passing down guy. And as playing in PPR leagues, we love these pass catching running backs. Tyrone Tracy right now for the Giants, running back 57. You can get him in the 14th round. That's Elijah Mitchell, Bucky Irving, Roshan Johnson territory. JJ, where do you stand on the rookie running back for the Giants, Tyrone Tracy?
Yeah, he's like my second highest rostered player in best ball so far. The reason I liked Tracy, so in my prospect stuff, he comped very closely to Tony Pollard. And that's not just because of like their versatility and stuff and the way that they, like Tyrone Tracy came from playing wide receiver for 4 years, played running back for 2. He's an older prospect. Pollard was a younger prospect, but they had a lot of that like Swiss Army knife versatility to their profile. And that's why I think the model, and they have similar size, which is why the model's like, oh wow, this is kind of a reasonable comp for Tracy. And I do think that we could see a Tony Pollard type role for Tracy, early career Tony Pollard in this Giants offense. The difference being they don't have a superstar running back like Tony Pollard had to deal with in Ezekiel Elliott. It's kind of strange to me that people aren't a little bit more hype on Tyrone Tracy when it's Devin Singletary and Eric Gray. And the other thing is that both Singletary and Gray are players who, they're solid. And Singletary's been a solid guy throughout his career, but neither player has been exceptionally fast and, a change of pace, big playability type players. They both actually had sub 90 speed scores coming out, which is a pretty rough number. That's weight adjusted 40 time. Tyrone Tracy was at like 104, which is an above average number. So I think at the very least with Tracy, we're looking at a player who's a good change of pace guy in that backfield. And then he's a good receiver, like you said. And so what if he takes some of that work and then he just shows off and he's good. And then he all of a sudden is a 150 carry back. Like, I don't think it's like probable, but I do certainly think that it's possible. And at the very least in a full PPR format, you should be able to get some of that receiving work out of the backfield from him, because I don't think the other two guys are special enough at doing that. And there's a chance that Tracy's at least really good at that.
He might be. And 5th round pick. So this is not just some UDFA. This is a guy that the Giants believe in, and the bar to jump over in New York, like you said, not a very high one. And the fact that you can only have to invest in a 14th round pick to get him on your roster makes him a really good selection. We've been talking a lot about 14th round picks tonight. Apparently that's like the gold mine for FFPC drafts right now with players. We got a gold mine with this show tonight. We're going to get into the second hour. I know we're already into the second hour, but it's been so much fun talking with JJ Zachariason from lateround.com. When we come back, let's get into it with some of these questions. Kamara or Kenneth Walker, Brooks or Najee Harris, and we'll leave things off. Kincaid or McBride, who would you rather draft? JJ Zachariason is going to tell us. I'm Eric Balkman from the FFPC. This is the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network.
The Bears have to be one of the most inept franchises of any sport I've ever seen in my entire life. And they share the city with the White Sox, who are also inept. Like, that is how bad the Bears are. I just don't understand how you can go your entire existence and the quarterback that wins you a Super Bowl is Jim McMahon. You couldn't find anybody else.
They don't have a good history with quarterbacks, and they let him be the quarterback for a long time too.
Deshaun Watson and Patrick Mahomes right there. Mm-hmm. And you drafted Mitch Trubisky. They were right there. I there's a lot of pain in being a Falcons fan. The Bears are one of the teams I could argue they might have it worse, and they have a Super Bowl. And when the best quarterback in the past 50 years is Jay Cutler, you have a problem.
That's so funny that you just said that. We were talking about Jay Cutler the other day, me and my friend, and I was like, yeah, he was on, because we were watching the Colorado Rockies game against the Giants, and it looked like he was behind the thing. I was, yeah, well, he played for Denver most of his career. We looked it up. Chicago let him be their starting quarterback way too long.
Here's the thing too, is that Jay Cutler wasn't bad. Like, he was erratic. He wasn't terrible, though.
The poor man's Brett Favre.
I'm taking him over Justin Fields. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would.
But Jay Cutler led that team to an NFC title game.
Yeah.
That they lost to Green Bay. But he's gotten farther than anybody else. You want to know who the other starting quarterback was for the Bears in the other Super Bowl appearance they made? It was Rex Grossman. What are we doing out here? It was Rex Grossman and Kyle Orton was the backup. How are you that bad? Bro, like, oh my God. Listen to the top 5. According to Football Reference, the top 5 greatest Bears quarterbacks of all time. Jay Cutler, number 1.
I can't believe it.
Sid Luckman, who last played in 1950, is number 2. Jim Harbaugh is number 3. Jim McMahon, the Super Bowl winner, is number 4, and he played there for 6 years. And Mitch Trubisky,
no way,
is number 5 on the list as terms of passing yard go.
The FFPC main event is off and running. Slow drafts going on right now. Live drafts resume tomorrow night. You can win a $1 million grand prize. It's our flagship event over at the FFPC, a $6 million prize pool there as well. So get in while the getting's good right now. myffpc.com, myffpc.com, or simply scan the QR code that you have on the screen right now. Thanks to our man behind the glass, Matt Deutsch, tonight, working very diligently on the show. myffpc.com is where to go for the FFPC main event. Would you rather draft? One of my favorite segments as we roll into the thick of drafting season here, and I'm talking with JJ Zachariason from LateRound.com, the host of the Late Round podcast, of course, living the stream as well. The tight ends are weird this year. For the first time in maybe in the FFPC's history, we do not have a tight end going in the first round, JJ, based on ADP. We have like 5 of them going in the second round, or at least 4 of them in most drafts, but none in the first round. So if you are sitting in the second round and you are looking at a player like Trey McBride, like Dalton Kincaid, who would you rather draft? I think based on what you told me earlier in the program, you're probably leaning towards Trey McBride here over Kincaid.
Yeah, I am. There's nothing wrong with Kincaid. I actually, despite that trend, I still think that like where the market has Kincaid and Pitts is reasonable. And so, I don't really have anything against them. I think going early tight end makes a ton of sense this year too. But with Trey McBride, it's just, you look at what he did last year and what he did down the stretch. It's really hard to say no to that. He was one of 2 tight ends to hit a 2 yards per route run rate or higher. The other one being George Kittle, who obviously does that based on just the massive and crazy efficiency that his offense saw. McBride's doing that in an offense that was not nearly as strong as San Francisco's. And he also, over his final 10 games last year, he had a sub 20% target share 0 times in that offense. Like that's just the numbers that McBride posted last year were unheard of from a consistency standpoint and from a predictability standpoint. We just don't see that at a very volatile position. Even like a Kelsey, you would see some sort of dip. We just weren't seeing it really with Trey McBride. Now, they obviously add weapons. They get Marvin Harrison in the draft. I don't think it's a lock that like that's going to happen again this year, but I'm relatively bullish on, the Cardinals offense in general this year with Kyler not coming off of that injury. I'm going to lean towards the player who showed us the crazy ceiling last year. I think Kincaid is probably going to lead that as it stands right now, probably going to lead that Buffalo team in targets this year. The one thing that I feel like is getting dismissed a little bit with Kincaid is the Dawson Knox thing, because when Knox was healthy last year, and I granted, look, Kincaid was a rookie, and I always hate that discussion when like that gets thrown out the window and people aren't like focusing enough on that, because that does matter a lot. Like there's a curve, a learning curve that happens, especially a tight end. We should expect a year 2 bump from these guys, which is why Kincaid's being drafted where he's being drafted. Right. But I do worry a little bit about there being competition at tight end, with Kincaid, where Dawson Knox is fine. He's not like this elite tight end and an elite piece, but Kincaid's numbers were worse, objectively worse when Dawson Knox was healthy last year. And I think that alone could be enough to say I'm going to go Trey McBride over Dalton Kincaid.
I maybe a better question for you, JJ, would have been Dalton Kincaid or Mark Andrews, because Kincaid's actually going about 3 or 4 picks higher than Andrews, and Andrews is a guy that we've already seen elite stuff from for a full season before. Who would you rather have in that scenario, Kincaid or Andrews?
Yeah, I think Andrews is just massively undervalued this year. I don't really get the Andrews stuff at all. If you look at his 2022 versus 2023, he had a nearly identical yards per hour run rate. He was used more heavily last year in the red zone. He averaged 13.5 PPR points per game last year. It was 12.7 in 2022. And so we're looking at ADP, and last year's ADP was higher than where it's at this year. I believe that's the case over at FFPC as well. Mm-hmm. But it's like, why? Like, his numbers were actually better in 2023 than they were in 2022. So why are we not? Is it because we now have a more than 1 year look at Mark Andrews not being uber elite? I mean, but part of the reason for it is because of injury and him not being able to finish games, and why his points per game average wasn't higher. Like, I think Andrews and Kelsey both. I mean, like, I think a lot of these guys are being undervalued based on small samples and based on there's not enough substance as to why they would be ranked as low as they're being ranked. So yeah, I mean, I think Andrews is a very strong candidate and a very good target right now. Especially in an offense where they didn't do anything at wide receiver this offseason, right? Like they add Tez Walker, like they lose OBJ. Yeah. Andrews could very easily be in that 25% target share range, and no one should flinch if that happens.
The thing that has me flinching in the second and third round, especially late second, is this decision between Devon Achane and Kyren Williams. Now, I don't know what it is with these guys. They're very similar in a lot of ways. Both very young players, both players that are going to be featured quite a bit on their offense, assuming health, players that battled health injuries, or battled staying healthy last year, battling injuries. But it just seems like, I don't know. Devon Achane seems to be the popular pick between these two. I don't know anybody who's really stumping for Kyren Williams. And yet, once again, Kyren Williams at the 212, Devon Achane at the 302. Williams is going ahead of Achane. Who would you rather draft this year between Williams and Achane?
I know that the math person in me is screaming whenever I say Achane, because the regression is inevitable, right? Mm-hmm. Like he had a 7.8 yards per carry last year. Not only was that the highest in NFL history among 100 plus attempt running backs, no one's ever gotten to 7, and he got to 7.8. I mean, like that's not going to maintain. That's not going to continue. But here's the thing with Achane. We saw the ceiling last year with him, and that was on a 35% rush share per game type rate for Achane. Like, it wasn't super strong because they were obviously giving a lot of work to Raheem Mostert as well. I have him projected now for like a 40%, and that puts him from a projection standpoint around like RB12, right? And so, but when I look at that, I always look, whenever I'm looking at projections, I think, okay, where can this go north and where could this go south? And with Achane, it can go north just by getting a 50% rush share, which is a number that is going to be hit by like 20 running backs this year, right? On a per game basis. And so I don't think that's like even close to out of the question for a guy who bulked up this offseason, who was so good per touch. And on top of that, he saw really good receiving numbers, even with a healthy Raheem Mostert. Now, I know they drafted Jaylen Wright, but my take on the Jaylen Wright pick has been that that's more of a Mostert thing than a Devon Achane thing. I mean, he's Mostert, obviously, I know he signed the extension, but he's getting up there in age. It's not like he's been super healthy throughout his career. And, they saw that they needed that depth even last season. Now, with Kyren Williams, when you think about the north-south thing, to me, there's more outs for it to go south for Kyren, where I did, if you want to look at the RB1 trends that I analyzed in the draft guide, there's two things that stand out with Kyren Williams. One of them, RB1s who had poor prospect scores, they generally don't pan out at good of a rate as guys who had good prospect scores. And so that's any year. They could be year 5. I mean, you're not going to see like year 9 and year 10 guys very often in RB1 range. So a lot of that's skewed towards younger players, and that's when prospect scores are generally going to correlate more to like what's going on in the league. But basically what it's saying is there's probably more fragility to that kind of player with a poorer prospect score because maybe the talent's not there or because the team investment's not really there, which it's not really there with Kyren Williams. I do think Sean McVay loves Kyren Williams. But then you look at what they did. They go out day 2 of the draft and they draft Kyren Williams. Like they draft a guy. If there's one running back in that draft who is the most like Kyren Williams, it's Blake Corum. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think that tells us that they were concerned about not having that depth last year. I think they're going to give Kyren Williams a shot to be a pseudo bell cow for sure. But the other trend that's interesting is that when an RB1 has a top 48 running back drafted with him from the same team, that RB1 also underperforms versus guys who don't have that. And so again, you're looking at Blake Corum, top 48 running back, at least in that range. And the reason for that is obvious, because a guy like Corum can take work away from who that RB1 is. And so to me, there's more outs for this to go set. Because I think if you look at ceiling, both of them have a pretty similar ceiling, right? Because we saw it last year with Kyren with volume. And I thought Kyren was good too, but we saw it with volume. And then we see it with Achane, the ceiling. If he just gets a little bit more work, like he could break fantasy football, like realistically. And so the ceiling is the same, but I think the downside is actually greater for Kyren because Achane can get by on efficiency. Like I think we're starting to sort of move into this era of fantasy football at running back where we only have 3 really obvious projectable bell cows, right? We have CMC, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, and then you have all these other running backs who have warts in some way. And one way to combat those warts is to know that you're going to get efficiency from the position. Usually efficiency is not very sticky year over year at running back, but you do see it when you get special players like a Jamal Charles, for instance, right? And Devon Achane to me might be that guy. And I think there's enough reason for us to say he could be that guy in this scheme and in this system. And so that's why I'm going to lean in on that a little bit more and go after Achane.
Yeah, it boggles. I mean, I happen to agree with a lot of what you're saying here, and I would take Achane over Williams too. And then you mentioned Corum too. When the Rams are telling Corum, like, look, we need you to develop a 3-down skill set. I mean, that's just like alarms going off.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we know what they want Corum to be. Now it's just a matter of if he can do it. And he has the draft pedigree where Kyren Williams does not as well. So right. I think that I'm with you on Achane over Williams. Sticking in the backfield, JJ, Alvin Kamara or Kenneth Walker. Alvin Kamara is currently going as running back 16, Walker running back 17 at the 504 and the 508. Who would you rather draft there? And anything you want to talk about regarding Zach Charbonnet is welcome in this answer here as well.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like my answer to this is mostly neither, if I'm being honest. I'm not really that high on. I'm worried about Kamara and this being the cliff. And there's a change in coordinate. Like there's just some question marks. But the thing is, I always lean on pass catching, and I believe in the pass catching much more with Kamara than I do with a guy like Kenneth Walker. I'm not as high on Walker than the market, and I'm higher on Zach Charbonnet than the market. Charbonnet is actually my number 1 drafted player this offseason. And I feel like people hear that and it's like the least sexy selection imaginable. They're like, oh my God, Zach Charbonnet, what are you doing? Your portfolio sucks. But yeah, it's Zach Charbonnet because if you look at where they're being drafted, there's a massive gap, obviously, between Walker and Charbonnet. And I think that the masses haven't really understood Kenneth Walker as a player so far in his career. He's a very good running back, but he's very, very much a home run hitting running back. It's not unlike a Saquon Barkley, right? Where Barkley will have lower success rates, but he's able to make these huge plays and these spectacular plays, and we love him for it. The difference between Barkley and Walker's not a pass catcher. He's not he's not getting a lot of catches out of the backfield. And that's dating back all the way to college. Like this is not a new thing for Kenneth Walker. And so my thing is Zach Charbonnet last year, when they drafted him, everyone's like, why are they getting this other running back? Well, I didn't agree with it with the capital they spent to get him, but I agreed with the idea that Kenneth Walker's a home run hitting back and Zach Charbonnet is more of that like James Conner in between the tackles, grinder, get the tough yards kind of running back. And we saw it last year. Zach Charbonnet, better in success rate, better in short yardage than Kenneth Walker. And actually, he ended up having a better 10 plus and 20 plus yard rate than Kenneth Walker did. But a lot of that just had to do with like him getting seeing like passing downs and getting like easier touches than what Kenneth Walker would see. But he's much more of like that grinder type back. And my question is, should we assume that this new coaching staff and coordinator change is going to love Kenneth Walker the way the previous coaching staff did? Do we know that for sure? And I don't think that we know that with 100% certainty. Am I drafting Walker over Charbonnet? Yeah, I am. I'm still like straight up. Yes, I have him ranked ahead of him, but I think that gap should be a lot smaller. And it wouldn't surprise me if they say Kenneth Walker is actually more of the, 35%, 40% rush share, while Zach Charbonnet gets 55, 60%, something in that range, because we want more of the consistency and the pass catching ability from our running back instead of Walker. So to me, I guess if I'm choosing between Walker and Kamara, I'm going to go Kamara in a full PPR format because I'm worried about Walker. But, it's kind of a dead zone area, and it's just not really the types of running backs that I like to go after.
And just to kind of piggyback on the Walker versus Charbonnet discussion, which we weaved into, it is pretty striking. Walker running back 17, Charbonnet running back 42. Walker 508, Charbonnet 1011. So you're talking about 5 rounds of difference. I'm with you. I mean, even if you don't like Charbonnet, right, that gap should be much shorter than it actually is. Over to the quarterback position, JJ, Anthony Richardson and CJ Stroud, 2 guys who were rookies last year that are lit up the fantasy world. Stroud for a full season, Richardson till he got hurt. Right now, these guys are going respectively, Richardson and Stroud, quarterback 5 and quarterback 6, 703 and 709. So Richardson about a half round ahead of Stroud. I have seen a lot of fantasy pundits out there talking about how Stroud might let you down this year. Are you in that camp as well? Who would you rather draft between Richardson and Stroud?
Yeah, I think it's unfair to say that he'll let us down, because I think that, he still has plenty of upside and plenty of potential with the weapons and such that are going around, or that are around him. Now, what I'll say is I did a podcast on this and I wrote about this in the draft guide. There's this thing that I call the pocket passer trap, where if you look at high-end QB1s who are pocket passers, they hit at a very, very rough rate compared to the mobile quarterbacks in that range, to the point where if you have a high-end QB2, so like QB13, let's say, who is mobile, historically since 2014, those guys have given you more of a floor and ceiling than the immobile pocket passers that have been drafted in the top 6 at quarterback over that time. So it's better to get the mobility and the mobile guys. So that's why I'm going Anthony Richardson. Now, I can give you another example. Since 2014, last year, first off, last year, CJ Stroud averaged 2.3 points per game with his legs. Okay, so we'll use 3 points per game with a quarterback's legs via rushing as our benchmark. Since 2014, of the quarterbacks drafted in the top 60 who were below that 3 points per game rushing, there's been 23 of them. Only 5 of them ended up exceeding ADP expectation. So we're seeing a situation where Stroud going this high, like the touchdown potential for Stroud is greatest for sure compared to any other pocket passer in the league. But realistically, there's a lot more variance with passing numbers than there is with rushing numbers at the quarterback position, to the point where, think about just like a regular play, like an 80-yard bomb gets a team down to the 1-yard line and they decide to run it in instead of pass it in, right? That's a big, big swing in fantasy, right? Depending on your scoring, it's either 4 to 6 points. And so there's a lot of variance there to the point where if you were to draft 2 high-end QB2s instead of CJ Stroud, odds are in your favor based on history that one of those high-end QB2s will outscore CJ Stroud this year.
Wow.
So I'm much more inclined to go that route, not use the equity on, to get a guy early because the opportunity cost is so high. I'd much rather just get 2, Tua type players or a Jared Goff type player than, one of those 2 guys, as opposed to going after Stroud.
And that makes perfect sense too. I mean, like pass catching running backs, mobile quarterbacks. This is what we love to have in fantasy football for sure. Jonathan Brooks and Najee Harris are 2 guys that, you think about where Harris, how excited we were about this guy, his rookie year. And now where he has fallen in drafts. Najee Harris, running back 25 at the 708. And he's fallen so far that a rookie on what was a really bad team last year, who is coming off an ACL tear, has now moved ahead of him to running back 24. Who would you rather draft this year, Jonathan Brooks or Najee Harris, JJ? This is a kind of a loaded one, because as similar as these guys are, there's a lot of differences in their game and a lot of differences in how they're going to get fantasy points this year.
Yeah, I like both of them a lot. I've been drafting both of them. I think it's really dependent. This is one of those team build situations where if I'm going pure zero RB and I need some sort of floor, at that RB1 spot, I'll probably lean Najee over Jonathan Brooks. But if I go anchor running back, or if I, for whatever reason, I'm getting too early or something like that, and I'm still looking at Jonathan Brooks or still looking at a running back in this range, then I'd go Jonathan Brooks. I'd feel more comfortable, not needing that like early season production from him. Now, do I think that if Brooks were fully healthy, I would absolutely take Brooks ahead of Najee, and we might learn more and get more optimistic about Brooks over the next month, to the point where it becomes obvious to go with him over Najee, because there's a real chance that he could be the bell cow in that offense. Look at Dave Canales stepping into Carolina and how he used Rachaad White last year. It was the Rachaad White show out of the backfield through the air. And he's already talked about wanting to run the ball a ton, but also using Jonathan Brooks, as a receiver in this offense. And to me, Brooks, like if Brooks hadn't torn his ACL, I think people would realize that he is a very, very good prospect. Like there's a lot to like with Jonathan Brooks. And that's despite the fact, even my model liked him, despite the fact that, he didn't really get any production until last year because he was playing with Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson at Texas. Right. And so I really think that Brooks, and there's a lot of market trends that suggest that if you get like a middle round or a dead zone running back that's a rookie, they usually outperform expectation. So I like Jonathan Brooks a lot, but I do think in this case, because I like Najee too, I do think in this case, if you're going zero RB, maybe lean on the safety of Najee, because I think Arthur Smith is going to lean on Najee, a decent bit. And then if you can afford it, maybe you get a Bijan early or something like that. Then just get Jonathan Brooks as your RB2 and then kind of fill it with some later round guys that you can maybe piece together at the beginning of the season when Jonathan Brooks isn't fully 100%. And then he could be a league winner down the stretch. Like he is a very, very good player.
Yeah, no question. And I'm excited about the shares. I got him in Dynasty. I've been drafting him in a couple of spots in managed redraft leagues this year as well. So very excited about Jonathan Brooks' future and his now. Speaking of his now, Permar99 hanging out in the YouTube chat room right now. He has a question for you in regards to Imani Bailey. Wants to know what your prospect guide had to say about Imani Bailey, the undrafted free agent running back for the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah, I haven't heard about Imani Bailey in so long. Because in the prospect guide, I look at every guy who went to the combine or who was drafted, but he wasn't anyone that the model was like super enthused about. The production profile wasn't strong enough. I think there were a little bit of size concerns maybe, but yeah, I mean, from off the top of my head, remembering what I had written about in the prospect guide, he's not someone that's really on my radar, despite being, in this environment that's fairly favorable.
The other thing I want to bring up here, I think I teased this at the top of the show. Let's talk about Bailey's real-life teammate, Xavier Worthy. Would you rather draft him this year in a revamped Chiefs wide receiver core that doesn't feature Marquez Valdes-Scantling, but does have Hollywood Brown, and Xavier Worthy is obviously there now, or Keon Coleman? We talked a lot about Dalton Kincaid and how the Bills replace all those targets that Stephon Diggs took up last year. Who would you rather draft? Rookie wide receiver addition here, Keon Coleman or Xavier Worthy, JJ?
Yeah, I think the most likely outcome for Xavier Worthy is that he's probably like a 80 to 95 target player, an 80 to 90 target player in year one. Just given, how the Chiefs kind of seemingly, move with their wideouts. And I understand Rashid Rice did what he did last year, but there wasn't that much competition. He's also a totally different wide receiver than Xavier Worthy. Like the pairing of Worthy with Rice is chef's kiss brilliant. You're going to get a guy who can stretch the field and a guy who doesn't stretch the field. But I'm going to lean Worthy over Keon Coleman because I have just as many concerns as a player. Like I don't have many concerns of Worthy as a player, actually. I thought he was a really complete prospect. Obviously, there's some size concerns, but he scored a 95 in my model, which is that's out of 100. Very, very strong score. Keon Coleman was at 86. And the difference between that in the model is fairly significant. Like we're talking like going from like a borderline elite prospect in Worthy to a guy where it could really go any direction in Keon Coleman. And realistically, I know that Keon Coleman has more of like a target share ceiling, but if you look at it from a projection standpoint, I think Buffalo is going to be relatively run heavy, like just what they did with Joe Brady down the stretch last year. And we know Kansas City is going to throw the ball a lot. They've been doing that for years with Mahomes and Andy Reid. So Even if Worthy hits like a 16 to 18% target share and Keon Coleman hits a 22 or 23% target share, Worthy could see a very similar number of targets as Coleman given the offensive environments. And if Worthy's targets are down the field more and probably a little bit more efficient, given the offensive environment, I'm just going to lean his way.
I think I'm with you on that. I'm a big Florida State fan, but even still, I still think Worthy is the player this year over Keon Coleman based on, I want a college football fan. I'm into my fantasy football analysis, but Worthy over Coleman to me is give me the guy on the team that has Mahomes that's going to throw a bunch. Josh Allen, and I know they added Ray Davis too. That ground game could be something that is more significant for Buffalo over the course of a full season in 2024 than what we saw last year. So that does give me pause a little bit on Coleman. So I would say Worthy over Coleman. Both of these players going in the late 8th round of the Fantasy Pros Championship. We'll step out and take our final break. When we come back, we'll take a quick spin through the late round draft guide. I have several questions here that I'm going to ask JJ about quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, more of a drafting philosophy segment and rather than a player take segment, which I know we've been doing throughout the program tonight. JJ Zachariason from Late Round takes us through his draft guide next on the High Stakes Fantasy Football on the Better Sports Network.
Is Dynasty. And the place to play is myffpc.com. Go to myffpc, use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more. Now is the time to get in there and get set up with a startup draft. Now is the time, now that the rookies and everyone are set, because you can go in and you can start the draft and, you draft your Justin Jeffersons and Jamar Chases. And now that we know where the rookies are and where they're landing, you get going on that. So you want to try and set a startup draft for this week coming up if you're not involved yet. So go get involved. Use the QR code here or use the promo code that's in the link in the description here and get yourself going on Dynasty so you can really enjoy these players and draft the players you believe in. If you like Michael Penix Jr., you got to play Dynasty because you got to wait for him, but the payoff is big. And same with like Pearsall and Jackson Smith-Njigba and all these guys. Get in and do that. And I'll tell you what, the orphan leagues over there that we've been talking about, those all got bought up. They're actually all sold. People from this show I know took over a bunch of them. So right now, startups is the way to go. That's the way to rock and roll. It is startup season. Startup season and rookie draft season. That's what's up. Get set up at myffpc.com. Use promo code COOP. They'll give you $25 when you deposit $35 or more and give you a leg up. No dealing with chasing around your friends and making them pay dues and having your buddy be like, oh, dude, I got to quit the league because I got a dog and I can't pay attention no more and I don't want to do trades. Forget all that. You can play online, MyFFPC, high stakes, low stakes, whatever you want to do with experts. And if somebody leaves the league, it goes in that orphan pool and somebody picks it up. The league has never been disbanded on FFPC.com. That's directly from Eric Balkman over there. Has told me that. So that's what.
If you're looking for some action tonight, Fantasy Pros Championship at the top of the hour. We have 3 spots available there. Excuse me, in an hour and 22 minutes. Beg your pardon. Not at the top of the hour. We have 3 spots available there. And if you want to draft at midnight in the Fantasy Pros Championship tonight, plenty of spots still available there. That draft should fill. MyFFPC.com is where to go. Join the Fantasy Pros Championship where you can win $1 million at a $350 entry fee, a $6 million prize pool. It's our deepest prize payout ever. MyFFPC.com or scan the QR code conveniently posted on your screen right now. High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network wrapping up here in about 20 minutes, and there's so much to get to with JJ Zachariason from LateRound.com, the Late Round podcast, of course, the Living the Stream podcast with Denny Carter as well. Let's jump right into it. I'll go position by position. I have read the majority of this draft guide. It's really opened myself. One of the ththings with fantasy football, JJ, when I was playing, and I've been playing now for, I don't know, since like the mid 90s, I lived in my own echo chamber for so many years, right? Yeah. I just wanted to take in analysis that I agreed with, that already agreed with my preconceived notions. And I realized probably about 15 years ago, that is the worst thing to do. Yeah. And you want to open up your mind. You want to challenge yourself on stuff that is not congruent with the way that you view winning fantasy football leagues. And you have opened my mind up to certain things, but in the late round draft guide, I do have several follow-up questions here. I'll kick things off with quarterbacks. You talked about when we talked about Richardson versus Stroud before. Mobile quarterbacks are the way to go. You are breaking ties in favor of mobile quarterbacks. I don't think that, and that goes without saying. I mean, that's probably what we should have been doing from the get-go. But when you look at the ADP of these quarterbacks this year and see where some of these pocket passers are going, and you see where some of these mobile quarterbacks are going, is there a certain way to attack the position in drafts this year other than simply, give me the guys with legs?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is there's not. And it's kind of cool. You know, when we first met each other years ago, I feel like it was just an obvious, you know, when I'm doing the late round quarterback thing, it's like, this is the obvious strategy. You know, you're getting a guy late. You don't have to worry about it, whatever. The difference now with quarterbacks is not the delta and the advantage that the top quarterbacks are giving you in your fantasy league. If you look back at 2011, 2012, 2013, and you look at the QB1 and how they finished versus the QB12, just, you know, the worst hypothetical starter in a 12-team league, the difference in points per game is actually pretty similar to what we see these days, right? Between the top quarterback or, you know, the QB1 to QB3 versus like the QB10 to QB12. It's pretty similar. What's different is we now know who those quarterbacks generally are going to be. And that's massive from a predictability standpoint, because now we go into a draft, we know that there are these rushing quarterbacks who are also really good at throwing the ball and can get 30 plus touchdowns. And I have a chart in the guide that shows the amount of players who are averaging 5+ points per game with their legs while throwing for 30 or more touchdown passes or 25 or more touchdown passes. You know, 10 years ago, it was like maybe one per season. You know, there's like, and now it's just, there's multiple every single year. There's just a lot of these guys, like they're everywhere. And it's not to the point though, where there's 12 of them where you can just wait forever in your 12-team league and be able to secure one of those guys no matter what, assuming no one gets two of those quarterbacks in their draft. And so what's going on here is there's a predictability, I don't know, I guess you can call it a problem if you wanted to go late round quarterback, but there's a predictability problem because mobility is much more predictable than the passing numbers are. Like if I were to tell you who's going to run for more yards, Kirk Cousins or Josh Allen, you'd say Josh Allen, of course, right? If I were to say who's going to throw for more touchdowns, Kirk Cousins or Josh Allen, you'd say, I don't know. I mean, that's going to be pretty close, right? And it's similar to like Jalen Hurts, similar to like Lamar Jackson. The pocket passers are not the ones dominating through the air anymore. And that's a huge, huge advantage for us when we're drafting these players, which is why CJ Stroud is a more questionable pick, because he doesn't have that predictability and that mobility, you know, to his, overall profile. So my answer to how we should be attacking quarterback, I think there's reason to get them earlier. I think that, you know, last year there was an overcorrection with how good they were the previous season, you know, in 2022. People were drafting them way too early last year because in 2022, they were giving you an outlier type advantage. The top guys were. This year, I think it's just reasonable. Like the market is very efficient, and it's okay to say that. It's okay to, you know, say that like, oh, the market's kind of getting this right. Like if you're in your home league, let's say, and Jaden Daniels is out there as the QB 18 because no one wants to draft a rookie quarterback, then yeah, get Jaden Daniels because he has crazy, crazy rushing upside, and you're going to get at least something from that. And then what if he has really good passing numbers, right? Obviously, like there's a chance that you don't get a mobile quarterback because there aren't, you know, an infinite number of mobile quarterbacks. If that's the case, lean in on players who have good pass catchers by ADP. That's one thing that there is some correlation with. So, look at that a little bit. But yeah, I mean, like, I think that where most guys go ADP wise is fine. And it really just depends on your team build and what you're comfortable with.
That's the quarterbacks, the running backs, the running back dead zone. I don't remember the first time I heard that term, maybe a half decade ago. I honestly can't remember. But it's something that I think when we try to define it, I don't want to say everybody has their own definition of it, but everybody has their own interpretation for it. When you look at the running back dead zone in this year's draft or in this year's ADP, what do you think the biggest misconception is that people have, maybe not just this year, but just of the running back dead zone in general, and how to either avoid or embrace it in order to make sure we are maximizing the output that we can get in our drafts, JJ?
Yeah, so the running back dead zone is an area of the draft where running backs, I don't want to say go to die, but where they're inferior in terms of talent, but they get drafted higher than they should because of the way that people perceive their volume. Best example of that is Mike Davis a couple years ago, goes to Atlanta, journeyman back, clearly not a crazy talented guy, but everyone's like, well, who else is going to touch the ball in Atlanta? Well, in comes Cordero Patterson to steal the day. And, Mike Davis's season goes to the crapper as a result of that. And so we see a lot of that in the dead zone. It's a talent related thing, right? Usually the dead zone starts based on history in like the mid RB2 range, into the RB3 range. The difference between those running backs has not been that dramatically different than the guys who are in the low end RB3 range and into the RB4 range, right? So because they're not that different, there's no reason to reach for those guys because there's an opportunity cost in doing so, right? And so the thing that gets misunderstood about the dead zone is that people think that it's like a round thing, like round 3 to round 6 is the dead zone. So don't draft running backs there. That's why I kind of changed things up in the guide this year to look more, not instead of round at positional ranks, because you can then transfer these ideas to any draft that you're in, because sometimes the RB12 in your league will go in round 2 and sometimes it'll go in round 5. It's not going to be the same from one draft to the other. All that shifts with the running back dead zone is opportunity cost, because sometimes when those dead zone running backs go in round 2, the cost to acquire them is much, much greater, which means you're losing out on really good wide receivers. So, there's some platforms, there's some formats where these running back these dead zone running backs this year are going in like round 8 or round 9. They're still dead zone running backs. They still are quintessential dead zone running backs. It's just that it's not that big of a deal if you get them because the opportunity cost is Cortland Sutton instead of Cooper Kupp. There's a big difference between that. And so I think that's the biggest misconception though overall about the dead zone is that like it exists in every draft. Like there are inferior running backs getting overdrafted based on perceived workload, right? And they don't pan out and they won't pan out. And there's some of them this year to me that are screaming dead zone running backs. But they do exist in every draft. It just depends on what that cost is.
So ironically, the dead zone is a living thing that will shift from draft to draft, right?
Yeah,
but
exactly.
We just got to make sure that we understand where we're at and where it is in our draft when we're drafting. Let's move into receivers here. We have not talked about this. I meant to bring this up with Jaden Daniels earlier, and we didn't get to Jaden Daniels. But what has your research, what have you discovered about receivers who are catching passes from rookie quarterbacks in your research? Is this a significant thing that we need to be bumping these receivers further down our draft boards? Is it, something that's non-significant or insignificant? What has your research shown you?
Yeah. So in a vacuum, it's significant. I'll just share this stat that's in the guide because I think it makes people be like, holy crap, I can't believe that. If you look at top 72 wide receivers since 2014, so this is in position, not 72 overall, but like top 72 wide receivers. So we're talking like wide receiver 7s here. And you look at them since 2014, there's been 159 of them that ended up scoring 15 or more PPR points per game. So obviously there's duplicates, like a Tyreek Hill will do it more than once, all that kind of stuff. But 159 wide receiver seasons. Only 4 of those seasons came from a wide receiver who had a rookie quarterback throw the ball 300 or more times for his offense. So only 4 of 159 15 plus PPR point per game seasons came from these top 72 guys. Now, everyone's like, oh my gosh, only 4. That's such a small percentage. Well, there's also a small percentage. This is where, like, I always go back. There was a tweet that I had sent years ago about Bill Belichick's win percentage and how he could have gone like 0-16 for 42 straight seasons and still had a better win percentage than Gus Bradley. It was like right after Gus Bradley got fired, and the tweet went viral and it was on SportsCenter, but it's just math. Like this is
right.
This is just math because the base rate here is what's important. And there's not that many rookie quarterbacks throwing 300 plus times per season in general. Right. So what I do is I look at it and see if we're adjusting for this, if this is versus ADP expectation, does this matter? And the answer to that is yes, a little bit. I would say that if you're looking at a Terry McLaurin, if you're looking at one of the Chicago wide receivers, you can get them where they're being drafted. I just wouldn't get them above ADP. I would not be reaching for those players because chances are, for them to exceed expectation, you want them to be at ADP or below ADP, because generally speaking, they don't exceed that expectation at as high of a rate versus, the guys who don't have those rookie quarterbacks. And the reason for it, rookie quarterbacks are just bad. They're just not as good. Yeah. Like the teams don't have as good of yards per play. They don't score as many touchdowns. They're sometimes more run heavy. So there's reasons as to why the receivers suffer a little bit.
To piggyback on that, Permar 99, talking about a couple of rookie quarterbacks here in Drake May and Jaden Daniels. Do you like Jalen Polk, Javon Baker better with Drake May, or do you like Luke McCaffrey better with Jaden Daniels in Washington? Strictly speaking on those receivers, not necessarily the quarterbacks, JJ.
Yeah, I really like Jalen Polk as a prospect, just at least versus the market and how they were viewing him. I feel like he was kind of shifted, like pushed aside for some of the other guys that kind of went in the range in the draft and stuff, because there wasn't like anything obvious about his profile that people were like in love with. But, we have to give a guy like that some sort of a bump, at least analytically, when they're playing alongside, Rome Odunze, Jalen McMillan. Like I've done it throughout this offseason, talked about how this Washington wide receiver group kind of reminds me of the USC team that had in the wide receivers with like a Drake London, Michael Pittman, Amon-Ra St. Brown, where I could see this being Rome Odunze being the Drake London. That's actually not a bad comp for him. Michael Pittman kind of being the Jalen Polk. And then actually one of my comps in my model for Jalen McMillan was Amon-Ra St. Brown. And so I think there's sort of this like a similar connection there where all three of these guys might be really good. The difference between like getting a Polk, I know you said McCaffrey in this question, but like, let's just say Polk versus like a Terry McLaurin, who also has, I know that it's not a rookie, but who has a rookie quarterback. The difference is cost, right? Like I don't mind getting Polk because I think he's good. And all of those New England players at cost are cheap. Like I don't mind Pop Douglas. I think Javon Baker's a fun dart because I thought he was a good prospect. Now I'm not bullish on the New England offense, but it's all versus where we're drafting them. And right. I think that they're better players than, I think they're better players than Luke McCaffrey. And it's harder for me to envision Luke McCaffrey emerging as the top option in his offense, whereas a Baker or Polk could easily do that in their offense.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're looking, especially where these guys are going in their drafts. Like this is
right.
We're swinging for home runs at this area. We're not swinging for singles or swinging for contact or just doubles. That's home run area, which is why you would look at a guy like Polk or a guy like Javon Baker. Yep. We touched on tight ends a little bit earlier. I know I can't remember if you said this on air or off air. I think off air. 500 some drafts you've done already this year. I know not a ton with tight end premium scoring, but if you were to give advice for people, and I know some of this is in the draft guide, but who are drafting in the FFPC or drafting in the Fantasy Pros Championship, how do you attack the tight end position this year? We talked about how none are going in the first round. We talked about several of the elite guys, quote unquote elite guys, in Kincaid and McBride and Andrews. What have you been doing? I mean, what's the proper way to get tight ends? Is it early? Is it late? What's the advice you would give somebody who is drafting in a tight end premium format?
Yeah, look, I haven't even been like a go early tight end guy throughout my fantasy analyst career. Like I think that you can make cases for either direction, but I think this year it's an early round tight end approach that's going to be optimal. And the reason I say that is because we're getting a decreased price. You've noted it. Every format, you look at your home leagues, you look at FFPC, you look at any of these best ball platforms, you're getting tight ends at a cheaper cost than you ever have at the top. Yeah. And you ask you have to wonder what's the reason for that. That's what I try to do like in the guide and just with my analysis in general. The reason for that is you look at the top tight ends last year, the top tight ends from an ADP perspective basically all underperformed. And then we had all of these late round tight ends emerge. You had Trey McBride off the waiver wire / as a late round dart. Jake Ferguson, you had the rookies in Kincaid and Laporta. You had all of these good late round tight ends. And so that has created a lot of confusion in the market here in 2024. Meanwhile, if you look at history and you look at what's gone on over the last 10 years, if you look at the top 3 tight ends, they perform from an ADP perspective. They perform so much better than the rest of the position in terms of predictability and in terms of giving you a ceiling. It's not even close. And in the draft guide, I knew that the argument against this would be, well, that's just like Travis Kelce doing it every year and Rob Gronkowski doing it every year. And that's why these top 3 tight ends look so good year in and year out. Well, I took Rob Gronkowski and Travis Kelce out of the data set, and I still looked at it, and the top 3 tight ends year in and year out, it could be top 4, you should be loose with the parameters a little bit. The top tight ends are outperforming the rest of the position from an ADP perspective so well. I don't think that's going to dramatically change this year. There's just such a clear trend that this is happening. What I think might be the case, sure, the top 3 tight ends might be a little bit worse than they typically are, and then the next 3 tight ends may be a little bit better than what we've typically seen. But even still, the at the end of the season, when we're looking at the top tight ends, the ones who gave you an advantage, it's going to be the guys that we're drafting early more than likely. There's going to be maybe 1 or 2 that came out of nowhere, and we're like, wow, how did Jelani Woods have this season, right? Like, right. It's going to happen, but based on history, it's going to be the top guys that we're drafting. And the nice part is the top guys are being drafted later, and so that opportunity cost is different. You're not having to spend a first-round pick to get one of these guys. And so your teams, hypothetically, if you still believe in the ceiling for a lot of these players, which I do, your teams can be powerhouses if you end up going that direction.
And that's usually the way I go almost every single year as well. Just trying to form a juggernaut, elite talent over everything else. And I think that you can fill in the cracks at running back and receiver, especially in managed leagues. Maybe not necessarily best ball later on with backs and receivers if you do go for an elite tight end early. A couple of dart throws. Let's just do this. Let's wrap up with this. A couple of dart throws from the late round draft guide that we maybe haven't touched on yet, that you have maybe already been drafting a lot, that you can wait and don't have to invest a lot to get these guys.
Yeah, I'll give you, we talked about him a little bit with Will Levis. I think that he is, if you can't get the mobile quarterback, I don't see a reason to reach for a, Goff type player necessarily, unless you're going with that like dual pocket passer type look where, the upside with those, versus like a Stroud is definitely there. It depends on format for this kind of thing, but Levis to me is just really intriguing. That offense, you're getting a new head coach that's going to want to run a pass heavy offense in Callahan. Saw that throughout his time in Cincinnati. We even saw it before Joe Burrow got there in Cincinnati with him. He's a pass heavy, pass friendly, 11 personnel type coordinator / thinker and schemer. And then Will Levis, his ADOT, his 20 plus air yard rate last year was 8 percentage points high. It was like 22%. And in second place was Jordan Love at like 14%. Will Levis just threw it down the field constantly, consistently, which, it didn't convert very often last year, but now you get better weapons. What if it does? And what if things really come together for them? So I'm really bullish on the Titans offense. That's one guy. I'll give you another one. I'm really into Kamani Vidal. I liked him as a prospect a good bit. I thought he was sort of like a DeAndre Swift. I had Matt Waldman on my show, and we both kind of talked about this, where he was, Waldman saw a DeAndre Swift in him. My model had a comp of DeAndre Swift. He's a shorter, kind of stockier running back who is shifty. He can accelerate really well, but he's really, really good in pass protection, and he's a good pass catcher. And if you look at what they have in LA, you get Gus Edwards as the early down bruiser, J.K. Dobbins coming off the injury. Gus Edwards is a 29-year-old running back who's never had more than 13 targets in a season, right? Like the competition there is very climbable. And I think Vidal is actually a really, really good player. And so I'm surprised that people haven't pushed him up a little bit more just based on the competition alone. But, it's the competition, and I actually think he's just a good talent. So I've been drafting a lot of Vidal this year.
Vidal makes perfect sense. I think the biggest thing is draft capital that has people a little bit skittish with 100%. Vidal. But I get it. And when you're talking about these Chargers running backs that are all going very late, why not get a smattering? And if you do like one of them, then get Vidal. Yeah. He does not cost a whole lot. Okay, last thing, the draft guide, which we've talked about throughout the program tonight. The 2024 edition, JJ, what are you most proud of this year that you have put in to the guide for everybody to check out?
Yeah, I think that I'm proud that it's done. That's for sure. I would say, I'm proud that I was able to kind of take, because I was doing a lot of the analysis in the previous years that I've done the guide by round, right? Like I was saying, the running back dead zone is round 3 to round 6 and but it's a little confusing when you try to transfer that analysis and that look to your particular league. Right. This year, I really changed it up to be and group things up by position. So this is what wide receiver ones, and these are the trends to look out for top 12 wide receivers, the wide receiver 2s. I call middle round receivers the wide receiver 25 to 42. And I do the same thing at running back. And then that way you can take that information, you can transfer it to all of your drafts and be able to utilize the trends, that I found by digging through this ADP data.
And you can get that at lateround.com right now. Get the JJ Zachariason late round draft guide now, lateround.com. Follow him on the X at Late Round QB. Of course, check out the Late Round podcast anywhere you get podcasts. And of course, as we get closer to the start of the season in August, Living the Stream with he and Denny Carter will be back as well anywhere you get podcasts. Wow. So much we covered tonight. I can't thank you enough. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from the draft guide. I will continue learning more as I peruse it more. JJ, thank you so much for being a part of the show tonight. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it. It's always fun to chop it up with you.
Absolutely. JJ Zachariason, watch him in action right here on the Better Sports Network for the Pros versus Joes, July 28th. That's a Sunday at 7 p.m. He'll be drafting in that draft. So check that out, and we'll have it broadcast here on BSN. Reminder to check out the Fantasy Pros Championship, the FFPC main event, the FFPC Superflex Best Ball Tournament, the Best Ball Tournament over at the FFPC, and Empire Leagues and Dynasty Startups as well, all at myffpc.com. That is where to go. For JJ Zachariason and our producer, Matt Deutsch, I'm Eric Balkman. We'll be back next week with Legendary Upsides Pat Kerrane here on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network. Enjoy your weekend, everybody.